Yeah, that's one of my biggest frustrations with baseball right now is there's no storylines. You used to have in the '90s you would have these rivalries. Boston hated the Yankees, right? The Dodgers hated the Giants, and so you had a little bit of a storyline, but players would stay with those teams for a longer period of time, so the fan bases could learn the personalities. And you'd play each other 19 times a year, but you expand that over 5, 6, 7, 8 years when a player might be with the team. All of a sudden, you have this hatred. The fans know that this happened 2 years ago with this player and that player. And now they match up again. So there's a story there. As free agency started to accelerate and players started changing teams a lot more often, a lot of those storylines, at least with the fans, faded, the natural ones. And so now the rivalries aren't as bitter and intense as they used to be, and because the players aren't there nearly as much or nearly as long, and now baseball hasn't replaced it with storytelling.
Yeah.
There is no storytelling surrounding Mike Trout. There's no storytelling surrounding Bryce Harper. Like, if this is going to happen, it happens by the player himself or potentially by the team if the team does a good job and wants to promote one of their superstars. But there's certainly no concerted effort to tell that story. Meanwhile, like you said, in the NBA, you have storytelling all the time. What you see before every NBA game is the star players walking into the arena in their suits, with their fashion, with their different shirts, their whatever they're showing off, and it's like there's a personality to the player, there's a story behind them, and they talk to him in this way. They have opportunities in public, and they embrace the individuality of the player. So I think that's one of the things that really frustrates me about baseball, and it's good to hear you say that that's kind of the approach you're taking in lacrosse. What are some of the ways that you've gone about doing that?
Well, it's really good to hear that and have this discussion because I was brought up to Portland, Oregon, by Major League Baseball to talk to all teams. Had to have been in January, and basically was sharing our social media strategy, how we think about it, and most of the attendees were social media managers and directors and kind of heads of content for all the clubs. I did a little research leading into it, and there were kind of two things, and I'm sure there are others, but two things that jumped out at me, which are two barriers or challenges for Major League Baseball, and both you kind of mentioned. The first is that if you look at the Big Four, which MLB is part of the Big Four, traditional sports, and like big revenue leagues, MLB, different than basketball and football, take it, is that both of the latter leagues, they begin developing their talent while their talent is in the NCAA ranks. And that actually the league doesn't do any development. They get someone like Zion Williamson propelled in the league. Like, the drafts are so big and it's very like easy to process as a fan. I'm going to watch the NBA draft. Zion's drafted to the Pelicans. I'm going to see him on ESPN later this fall. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And in baseball, one of the biggest challenges is that you have minor leagues. You have drafts of players who are getting, pulled out of high school. Sometimes they play in college. Maybe they can't. I'm not sure. And then they go to the minor league system. Then they get pulled up and pushed down. So just by virtue of that unpredictability, you can't develop stars as easily as the NBA and the NFL does. And so what you're left with are the cream of the crop, and that's where the MLB kind of invests. So that's backed by data. So I had my manager before this presentation I gave to MLB pull on CrowdTangle the delta of followers between like a Bryce Harper and then like someone who's probably on the margin from a skill gap standpoint. It's like you have your top dozen players that have literally millions of followers, and then the next group, a lot of them have like 10,000 followers. It's a huge delta. So that's a challenge that Major League Baseball has. And I don't know the solution because there's a lot of value in the minor league system and all that stuff. So that was one. And then two is, I think, similar to hockey, Major League Baseball has a ton of tradition behind it that makes it's like a catch-22. It makes the players in the game, the pastime that it is, and like the game of America. But it also limits the athlete's ability in a world where millennials, Gen Zs, and definitely Gen Alphas, which is the next group behind Gen Zs, like feel the connection and the humanness that athletes have and want to show. For example, God forbid you flip a bat when you hit a home run, right? Like, you just can't do it. And like, you don't want to talk shit in a press conference. Like, it happens from time to time, and when there's a fight, it's amazing. It's like viral and everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying like, hey, let's promote fighting in MLB, but like, there's very little. It's far more rare to see that in baseball than it is in basketball and football. And then hockey has that kind of traditional culture where they're very respectful. They leave it on the ice and they step away. And being respectful, again, is important, but you've got to embrace personalities in professional sports. And that's what we think about is like, man, lacrosse is nowhere near the big four. And our athletes have never had access to platforms and microphones where they can amplify who they are. Now they do. So we're not only giving it to them, but we also, Trevor, have to like retrain them, because the last bit of media training they had was in college. And college, you know, you're taught to like sit up straight in a press conference and compliment your opponent and say you got lucky, right? So you got to break through that, because you know at the core of every athlete is like, no, I'm not lucky. I've worked my fucking ass off for this. And I had to compete one-on-one. You can say like, yeah, that guy's gotten the best of me before, but not this time. And like, people just want to hear authenticity. Because of social media, it's brought out, you know, basically an entire audience that has X-ray vision around authenticity. And if you're not getting that, you're just less likely to engage with.